Hello there, welcome back and welcome to part 46 in my build log series of the Trumpeter 1:200 scale model of the Titanic. Today I am working on the raised portions of the ceilings above the first class smoking room at the very aft of the boat deck. And I'm doing everything that is entailed within that job, cutting out plastic, resetting the LEDs for the internals of the room, also resetting the LEDs on A-deck promenades, making all the connections, etc. Exactly the same process, really, as I did on the lounge in the reading and writing room a few episodes back. I'm also just going to finalise the power supply for the LEDs, which I had a couple of little outstanding jobs from the last episode that I'll cover today as well. So, without any further ado, let's crack on with this. Now, as you remember in the last episode, I said I was going to change out this yellow wire. And the reason for that is because it's very thin. And the thinner a conductive path means a greater resistance. So what I've done instead is I've got some sort of a lime green colour wire, I guess. And this is quite a lot thicker, which will mean that the conductive path has far less resistance and therefore we're not going to be wasting as much energy. We're not talking about a great deal of resistance because it's still made of copper, but nonetheless, as all of the power for all of my LEDs is going through this wire, it does make sense for it to be a bit thicker than that. So this lime green wire is a wee bit thicker. I think it's, what is it, 0.5 millimetre, that's 0.5 square millimetres. So it's not huge, but by electronic standards, that's actually a fairly thick piece of wire. This is multi-strand. A multi-strand is basically a Ponzi way of saying there are multiple different copper threads which make up the connection. Multi-strand is quite flexible. You can see it bends, but it also sort of pops back into shape. So you'd normally use multi-strand for wires that are connecting different circuits together or that sort of thing. You can get wire called single strand, which, as the name suggests, just uses a single piece of copper. And you tend to use those for connections on a single circuit board, you know, from jumping from one track to the other. However, wires like that don't do very well when they're repeatedly flexed. What happens is that the copper in them fatigues, and then over time you can actually lose your connection. The copper can just break in two. So they're not very good in a situation like this, where this board is going to be somewhere and I'm going to have another piece of circuitry elsewhere. So I need a wire that's going to flex, hence multi-strand. What I've done there is I've just removed the old solder that was holding on my old wire. So that's now exposed the hole again, so I can put a new piece of wire in. What I've used is this stuff. It's called solder wick, and essentially it's just like a copper, sort of a copper brush. If you ever used Scaledecks, this sort of racing car game as a kid, it's exactly the same stuff you'd use on the brushes of those, but it's just copper, and when you apply heat to it, it sucks the solder up, and it cleans the track nicely for you. So what I'm going to do, give myself a nice hearty length, because better to have more length than less. Don't read anything into that. And then we will make the joint. Back in a tick. Right, the board's now in and everything is finally plumbed into place properly. You can see there is the board. And as you can see, I have covered pretty much all of it in electrical insulation tape. Now the reason for this is because there's always potential. Sorry, for those of you who don't get that, that's a really shockingly bad electrical engineering joke. But there's always potential for things to short if you have exposed conductors, so it's worthwhile putting a bit of insulation tape or putting a bit of heat shrink around things after you've soldered them. So, ignore the kettle in the background, that's just kettling along nicely. I thought I'd show you how I actually cut out these sections here. Now do bear in mind, this is a process where it looks a hell of a lot worse before it gets better, if you know what I mean. So the piece of equipment I'm using here is essentially like a sort of hot rod. Basically it's a soldering iron with a very long point on it. And that gets hot enough to melt through the plastic, and it makes cutting through what is here really quite thick plastic quite easy. So all I'm doing with this is I'm just sort of pressing in and out and moving along a line. What I'll do now is I'll move on to time lapse because it's not very exciting, and I also want to put the extractor on, and then we'll carry on. Right, really satisfying bit. Oh. There we go. And this is usually the point where I start to think, what the hell have I done? I've changed the model from something that was looking pretty good into something that looks awful. But you've got to have faith in the process. It does look dreadful at the moment, I know. But a bit of cleaning up, redoing the lights, getting the new piece on top, and it will look way better. And as an added bonus, this is not insubstantial in weight. You can see the thickness of the plastic. So this isn't insubstantial in any way. So saving all this weight is never a bad thing. So I'm just going over here now with a very sharp scalpel blade, and I'm just cleaning up the rough edges. I'll do the top side first, and then I'll move on to the underside as well. And this is quite important, just to guarantee that when I do put the raised ceiling on later, that it actually seats properly. You know, it needs to have a flat surface to bond onto, and that'll help with adhesion. It'll also help with things like light bleed as well. Did think it'd be worthwhile just showing this as well. I've neatened up the edges now, and as with the lounge and the reading and writing room area, this now looks really quite rough, but the reality is it's actually pretty smooth. It's just because we've got a sort of stramash of different bits of coloured plastic and stuff all melted together that it looks a bit gruesome. But when you're heating stuff up, there is that possibility that things can warp and, you know, change shape and things that you really don't want to happen. So what I'm doing is I am just going to check that the raised ceiling does fit comfortably on top, and that there's no sort of, like, you know, knobs of plastic or anything that are going to spoil the look. And it does look like it fits on really quite snugly. Of course, the advantage of this is I can glue it firmly down so that I get a really nice solid bond. But that looks okay, actually. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to get my new LEDs into the various positions, check that it works. Then I'm going to paint this up. I'll need to paint the inside black as well, get the frames on here like that, get some new strip LED lighting in here, which will be the lights for this area, and hopefully possibly these areas as well. Then I'll glue it all together, and that'll be the job done. Right, I'm just getting some new LEDs in place to replace the old ones that suffered when they were removed. So as with, I mean, the whole process is a pretty much carbon copy of what I did on the reading and writing room area, but I'll show anyway. So just add a bit of glue there, get the thing stuck down, and I tend to use some kicker in this area just because otherwise it tends not to grab very well. Let's do one more. Here is another one. So feed it between the deck housing and the deck. There we are. And then just glue in place. As per usual. Simples. Right, this one's a little more involved because I need to go through this hole and sort of thread the LED out, but it's still not that tricky, really. There we go, see. And then as before, glue in place, and we're done. And now we're pretty much ready with a complete circuit on that side. So we need to be a little bit careful about light bleed, so I'm going to pop some black paint on the inside, and I'm also going to do that on the outside where the deck's going to go, because I've explained this before, I think, but the Scaledecks is so thin that if I put Scaledecks onto a white underside, it will look different to if I put Scaledecks onto a black underside, and all of my other decks have gone on top of black, so I need to replicate that here. So I'll do this side first, and then I can flip over and do this side. Right, so as before, I'm just getting these frames, window frames, onto the actual stained glass bits. So what I'm doing is getting a bit of glue and just popping it on the other side of the frame from where my blue tack is. Then I can get the frame in place, stick it down, and there we are. Same again, bit of glue onto the frame. Align it and stick it down. There we are. Then, once they're actually on the sheet, I get more glue and I go around the entire outside of the frame. And the capillary action of this glue being very thin sort of sucks it underneath the frame and gives us a really nice bond. And of course, because I'm cutting the glass out, any sort of overspill will be removed by that process. So eventually you end up in a situation where you have 4 frames really nicely on the glass, which you can just cut out and then stick down. Right, so now cutting out these pieces now that they've had time to dry. And I don't know if you can quite see it, but you can see, oh you can, yeah. The outline of the glue is on the outside of the window frame only. And the actual inside of the frame looks pretty pristine. So, just line it up. And I like the edge of my scissors to be scraping against the bottom of the windowsill. There's one. Might require a little bit of trimming. Not very much. There we go. So I'll just show one of me fitting these windows. These are the windows on the other side. These are the ones that are yet to be done. And you can see I've got my 8 windows down here to be fitted. So what I do, bit of glue, and I mean this is exactly the same as on the living room, the lounge rather. So bit of glue around the rim of the window, pick one up, plonk it down. I'll just make sure it's in the right place. Then I tend to sort of whack it, just squash it a wee bit more to make sure it's actually properly in, and there we go. Pretty simple. It's a bit fiddly. These are a bit harder than the lounger's windows because they are a bit smaller, but it's doable again, as with most of these things. Take your time and you'll be fine. So, as always when I'm doing these LEDs, first things first, I need to wrap them in this headlight tinting kind of foil, I guess you could call it. So it's pretty straightforward really, but just to demonstrate it again, wrap it all around, and then just for the sake of longevity really, I super glue it in place. It is self-adhesive, but I don't really trust the self-adhesiveness of the foil, so I glue it myself, and then it's just a simple case, once the glue is set, of cutting off any excess. Nice and easy. So it's necessary, particularly on these sort of strip LEDs, to get these terminals prepared for soldering, because they're initially covered in a sort of rubbery kind of clear plastic gooey kind of thing, which gives the strip its waterproof quality. You've got to sort of scrape that off, and then I find you really got to then actually go in with your soldering iron and melt some solder onto the terminal before you can really guarantee yourself a reliable connection. And you see what I'm doing is the solder's now flowed, but I'm just sort of working it round so that all the copper's been wetted by the solder. And that'll give me a nice and a much more dependable joint. Same on this one. Just work the copper round with the iron. Sorry, move the solder round with the iron. And there we are. Now I've got 2 blobs of solder which will actually quite happily accept the wires that get soldered onto them. Same on this side. Before even using the soldering iron, I use my nails to scrape as much of the plastic off as I can. Yeah. And then use the iron just in nice small circles over the pad. And get some solder. Then on to the other one. And there we are. Not too tricky, but it can be a bit problematic. Right, now to glue these in place, and as with every single thing on this deck, negotiating these free floating wires is a bit of an issue, but anyway, not that bad. So I'm not going to put too many lights in the smoking room this time around. It is a, I think it should be a sort of dimly lit room rather than a room that's blazing with light in the same way that something like a restaurant or the lounge might be. This should be a bit more subtly lighted, I think. So I'll put these in. And they'll just dry for their involution. And once they're dry, we can start to have a think about actually wiring everything up. Right, so I've got everything wired up now. All the LEDs are in. You can see that I've got this chain here and the chain right on the aft, and also this chain here. Now you might be wondering why some of the chains start, for example this chain, these 4 LEDs here. The positive connection comes from this point, goes via a resistor out to the first LED, second LED, third LED, fourth LED, and then it comes back to here. Now the reason I can do that is because on these LED strips there is a plus and a minus side, and because I've wired these all together and because they're wired in parallel, a plus there is exactly the same as plus over here or plus over there. So any one of those connections would complete the circuit. So that's why I can do it. I don't need to return each of my chains back to its original source. And here we are again for the umpteenth time, and you can see that these lights are now all functioning properly. Right, so in an effort to rectify the lack of light in this area here, because remember I used to have LED strip running the whole length and now I've only got LED strip here. So this area, the veranda cafe area, is not getting much light. What I did is I put 4 LEDs in a circuit around there. But as you can see, there is a slight issue, and that is that presumably the distributor has made a bit of an error, because I have only ever ordered warm white colour LEDs. But what I now seem to have is red LEDs. So my knowledge of the light bulbs used in the Veranda Cafe is not exact, but I'm pretty confident that they weren't red. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't used as a photography darkroom. So I'm going to have to take these all out again and replace them with 4-off LEDs in warm white instead. Right, that's a wee bit better now. Titanic minus a nightclub at the back. These look a wee bit better, and they're probably not quite as bright as the LED strip was last time, so these might well give me a better look. What I'm going to do, because I've not done it yet, is I'll pop this deck down on top and we'll have a look at what the Veranda Cafe now looks like. So here we are, and actually That is so much better. Just with those slightly less bright LEDs, you can really see into the room now, which is, well, it just gives it a much better ambience. Actually, I wouldn't have predicted that this would end up looking better beforehand, but it really does. You know, you can now see the people in the armchairs in the rooms, and that is really quite nice. So there we are. Bit of a strange one with the red LEDs, but you know, I mean, I'm not adverse to a nightclub. I just don't think they're really popular in 1912. You know. So yeah, that is now the lighting repaired in this section, and of course the raised ceiling complete. As with the lounge, you can see there is still a little bit of light bleed there, but I'm waiting for a product that I've ordered before I'm going to fix that. And similarly, there is a bit of light bleed on this section as well. You know, you can see that here. But that's perhaps for another episode to fix. Now, one of the things that I do quite like about this, and this is just really because I've used less LEDs in the smoking room, is that the light there now does look markedly less bright than it used to. And I like that. You know, if you think about a smoking room, it's a room that is firstly panelled in very rich dark wood. There's dark red leather chairs. There's a sort of haze of smoke in the room. It's not going to be a really brightly lit room. It's going to be almost like a sort of cocktail kind of bar. You know, it's going to be a half light rather than a full light. So I like the fact that this room is now quite a lot darker, for example, than the lounge, which is, you know, what you could almost sort of say a blaze of lights by comparison. You know, the lounge is clearly a lot brighter, and that works. You know, that to me, that makes perfect sense, and I really like that. And, you know, part of it's because there's stained glass in all these windows. As you can see, there's stained glass in the big bay windows and there's stained glass in the skylights. But also it is partly because there is just literally less lighting in the room as well. But it really does give a nicer kind of vibe to what I was getting before. So I'm really happy with this now. And as with the lounge, I do think the raised ceiling really does actually improve the look of the ship markedly. And there we are, that's all I'm going to cover today, because that's all I've done up to now. As I say, my modelling tends to take a bit of a hit at Christmas. So that's all I'm going to be covering. Interestingly, this time last year, I hadn't even started work on any of the Scaledecks or anything. I just started to dig out the decks and you know, measure them up and put them in place and stuff. So we've covered a hell of a lot of stuff this year, you know, all of the forecastle, poop deck, both of the well decks, and a substantial portion of the superstructure as well. So making a lot of progress, and hopefully next year the model might even be complete by Christmas. Hopefully it'll be sitting proudly on a shelf, having done its maiden voyage successfully. But anyway, we'll see how we go on that. There's no rush. So if you've enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe. If you've got any questions or comments or anything like that, just pop them down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. And I'll see you in the new year. So have a very happy new year. Bye for now.